Hello everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths on my engine testing raft. And in the last episode we kind of went over a little bit of like design philosophy, the way I see it. We went over the parts a little bit, and I discussed the engine design triangle, and I explained it, but you know, for some people it's kind of hard for them to understand, so I kind of built it for them over here. I kind of built it for you over here, and what it is just a triangle. And one thing I learned is triangles are freaking hard to build in from the depths, but there's a triangle, okay, and we have some signposts here. Over here we have efficiency in this corner, and we have power over in this corner, and over there we have density. Okay, and so when we build engines in from the depths, we need to know, when we build an engine, we need to know if it's good or not. We need to know if is it super powerful over here? Is it super efficient over here? Or is it super dense over there, meaning space? Efficient space usage, efficient fuel usage, or efficient at making power. We need to know what it is, and it's all relative. So if I took one of my motors and I compared it to one of your motors and they use the same space, if one makes better power and one makes more efficiency, then I can make the argument that this one is better, and you can make the argument that this one is better, because they make two different things, and there is no clear consensus on where it is. And then if you don't know, if you have no frame of reference for what is an efficient motor, what is a powerful motor, or what is a compact motor, if you have no reference, then you're just kind of floating around in this triangle somewhere in this triangle, and you don't really know. So what this video is about importance of having a rating system and a perspective on this triangle. And we'll start with power. Power is easy. Power is the easiest to visualize and see in this in these engines over here. This motor makes 100 horsepower because it's got one cylinder. Then we get to a two-cylinder that makes 200 horsepower. We get to a three-cylinder. You know, the power in this game is linear. It's stepped. If you use injectors, is the only way you can have anywhere in between 100 horsepower is by making your motors run hot, so we're talking injectors, and it's not a good thing. If you're making anywhere between around 100 horsepower, if you're not making 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, you know, all the way up to say 20,000 horsepower, because I don't know how much horsepower you can make when in the 1,000 block limit of a motor. I think it's 1,000 blocks. I'm not. Let me check that, because I'm not 100% sure, but I thought there was 1,000 block limit on motors. It says which is 1,000. I'm not sure. That seems like more than 24 components. But if it is 1,000, I don't know how much power you could make on 1,000. But if it is 1,000 parts, and say you can make 100,000 horsepower in 1,000 blocks, the linear, it's going to be linear. It's going to be 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, and as the motor grows, it's just going to be in multiples of 100. The only time it is not 100 rounded out to 100 horsepower, you know, 2,400, 3,600, 12,800. The only time you're not going to have that is if you use an injector. And injectors, the only reason you would have that, not 100 horsepower, well, in the case of one injector on one carb, is going to be because the more fuel an engine uses, the hotter it runs. The hotter it runs, the less efficient it becomes, and the less efficient it becomes, the less power it makes. You don't have this problem with carburetors usually, only with injectors. And injectors, this mechanic on injectors only works toward the negative side. They only lose power as the motor heats up. They don't gain you power as the motor heats up, so it's a bad thing. So if your motor is not making, you know, a multiple of 100, it's because it's overheating and you're not getting the maximum power out of it, which is another reason why I consider injectors, not only are they less efficient than carburetors, they have this flaw where if the motor gets too hot, they make less power, and the only thing that makes motors use more fuel in this game is the injector. So this is why I don't like injectors, and another reason that power, this is the easiest side of the triangle to describe. And another thing about it is when I was talking about when you're designing a motor, your motor is going to fall somewhere within this triangle. It's either going to be powerful and fairly dense, you know, along this side, but if it's along this side, it's probably, you could build a motor super powerful and dense on somewhere along on this triangle, and as you lose power and make it more smaller, it's going to be less efficient. You know, you can move this time and keep the same efficiency, but you're never going to get maximum efficiency. If you make a dense motor and an efficient motor, you walk this line, it's usually not very powerful, and then if you walk power and efficiency, it's usually a huge motor. So you can usually pick two, and power is not something you normally choose because zero power in a ship does you zero good. You have a certain power requirement in your ship, so you don't really choose this one. But I'm not saying that you get to have, there's 3 factors of design and you get to choose 2. I'm not saying this is burning up one of your choices because all motors make power. So we're excluding this. We're not worrying about power because if I have a 5x5x5 space, I'm going to make a motor. It's going to have power. There's no point of making a motor if it doesn't have power, and it's going to be we're under a density restriction, so we have to choose density as one of our you know, we're not choosing density, we're restricting density. So by restricting density, we're somewhere, you know, between the center and density, and then we got to try to make, you know, as much power and as much efficiency as we can within that density rating. So, but you know, that makes, you know, if you got a 5x5x5 space and you need 1,000 horsepower, well, power is chose and your density is severely limited. That's going to lack, you're going to be limited in how efficient you can make the motor in that space. So power is pretty easy. You just make a motor as big as, make a motor as powerful as you can, or just meet the needs of your power requirements, you know, and in the space that you have. And if you can't do it, you have to make your space bigger or make your ship use less power. So this is easy. Power is super easy to understand. It's very linear. You're not gonna, somebody's not gonna build a motor, a 5x5x5 motor that makes 2,400 horsepower, and then somebody builds a motor that makes 2,401 horsepower. That's a sad fact about From the Depths, the way the motor system is. It's in 100% increments. You can only make a 5x5x5 motor that makes, you know, it makes 1 horsepower less if you're using injectors or if making the motor run a little bit hotter, it can make less power, but it can't make more. So power is super easy. You don't really choose that. You just get the thing. Density is fairly easy too because it's space. Space is how much space you have. Now, on an engine test platform, I got unlimited, so I could build as big as the motor as I want. But that doesn't tell me anything about, is this motor more dense than this motor, or is this motor more dense than that motor? How do I tell density? Well, you need a rating system, and I'll show you the rating system I came up with. And then there's efficiency. Efficiency is fuel usage that doesn't care about power or space. Usually, if you take a 1,000 horsepower motor and you start making it more efficient, you usually have to add parts to it, which makes it less dense. And then if you want to keep the density the same, if you want to bring the efficiency, move toward this side of the triangle, if your motor's here and you want to make it more efficient, you usually have to give up either space or power, and you can't have both. You know, like I said, that's where I come up with you can have these. One of these 3 things exist. You could pick 2, but you know, efficiency, I would say you make the power that you need in the space that you need and make it as efficiency as possible. A 100% balanced motor, like I said, if this is the line from the least dense all the way to the most dense motor, this is the line to the most powerful motor all the way over to the least powerful motor, and this is the line from the most fuel efficiency all the way to the least power efficiency. A balanced motor would be this black box right in the center of the triangle. And you'd say, well, how do I know if I am in the center of the triangle? You need some form of perspective. You need some form of perspective. And one of my favorite motors here is this little 3-cylinder. When you get into the small motors, it's a 3-cylinder 400 horsepower motor. It is power per fuel is 1200. Maximum power per fuel achieved is 1254, and it uses, through its power band, it uses 0.1 fuel at 10%, uses 0.3 fuel at 50%, and 0.3 fuel at 100%. And we go, well, is that good? Is that, because you can't compare that motor to, say, this motor, because this motor uses 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. You say, well, that's using 0.3 across the power band, but this motor's making 800 horsepower, and this motor over here is only making 400. So you can tell that this motor is more efficient, but it's also bigger. And then, so you go, well, how do I know? How do I know what is good efficiency? How do I know what is good power? How do I know what is good space use to make a motor that is balanced like this right in the center? Well, you have to know what is the least amount of power you can make, which is easy because it's 0. And then what is the most amount of power you can make, which I absolutely do not know, because like I said, you can only, I think you can use 1,000 blocks on a motor, and I don't know what maximum power attained is. And even if you use I don't know if it's a hard limit, like you can only have 1,000 engine components on your craft, or because let's say I got a 6,400 horsepower motor that only uses 500 pieces. Well, I could put 2 of them in the craft, and I didn't break that 1,000 limit, and I just can keep stacking them and stacking them and stacking them and stacking them. So I don't really know what maximum power is, so I don't really know where the center of the triangle is. what is the maximum efficiency from just an injector is probably injector on a single cylinder is probably the worst you can have. I think you can get, I've seen motors that draw hundreds of power. I mean hundreds of fuel per second. So I don't know what exactly the worst is, and I do know what the maximum efficiency is. The maximum efficiency, the maximum power per fuel I've seen is somewhere in the 70,000 power per fuel range. But I'll get into why that's kind of like BS. And the worst power is, these are not concrete settings, because the worst power can be, I think, about 79 fuel per second or something like that. I don't know what the most is. And then the most efficient I've seen like a 70-something thousand power per fuel or something. I think if you go by power per fuel, the maximum efficiency would be 70-something thousand, and the worst is like about 168. I don't know what it is on an injector. I got a little injector motor set up over here. Let me go see what it. Let me go see what the worst. I know the worst for a fuel motor is, I think, 151. I think this is the worst you can get on a fuel motor. Let me see what an injector motor runs at. Oh wait, this ain't the most inefficient injector setup I got. This would be the most inefficient injector setup that I got. Okay, so here it is, about 66 power per fuel. That is terrible. So let's say that we could push it worse and get it down to like 50 power per fuel. So the range for efficiency, the range for power is going to be 0 to whatever the game, till your computer crashes from all the parts put into engines. And then you remember you got to have blocks to encase those. You have to have a ship to put those in. So the limit would be 0 all the way to your computer crashes. The efficiency would probably be about 50, maybe 50 power per fuel, all the way up to 70,000 power per fuel. And then space is something, I would say the most space efficient motor would be putting a cylinder on a block and making 10 horsepower. That would be the most efficient motor, would be all the way in that corner over there where the black sign is, but you're not making any power. You're only making 10 horsepower, and it would only use 2 blocks. So I don't even know if the density would be that high at that point, but the least space efficient motor would still probably be somewhere up with the most powerful motor, and that would be a motor with just so many freaking parts that it's freaking huge. So that's, if 1,000 engine blocks per craft is a hard limit, then the least dense motor would probably be 1,000 blocks, and most dense. But actually, the dense, you can't, I mean, if you're talking pure size, a engine block on a cylinder on an engine block would be the smallest motor, and the biggest motor would be 1,000 blocks of motor. So if we have to assume that density is space in this particular example, but it kind of shows the importance of, to get here in the center, to get balanced, we need a perspective. We need to know, we know power, we know from powers from 0 to whatever the limit is. We know that space is from 2 blocks all the way up to 1,000 blocks, and we know efficiency is probably from around 50 power per fuel, and I don't know if you can get it to 1-to-1 to where it's making 1 power per fuel or something like that, or push into the negatives to where you're making more power. You need multiple fuels to make power. I don't know if it can be pushed like that, but let's say it's 50 to 70 something thousand. How do you know where you're at in here? So let's say I make a motor that uses 500 power per fuel. where am I at? Am I in the center? Am I over here? Am I right here somewhere? Where, 150 tells me you're somewhere over here. You're way away from that efficiency. 150, if I could stop falling off the craft, 150 power per fuel. Okay, so if we're 150 power per fuel, we're probably like right here. And I would say probably somewhere around 1200 power per fuel is about right here. I'll explain why I think this is a 1200 power per fuel range, and then this would be about if we use the hard limits from 2 blocks to 1,000 blocks, this would be somewhere in the 500 range. And then in the power category, I would say your average power used on most ships is going to be nowhere near the center. If we're talking about getting away from the power, here's the 0 range, and there's 1,000 blocks worth of power. I would say most ships only need to be about right here, 1,000 to between 1,000 and a couple. I would say the most power hungry ship I have is about 12,800 power, and I would say that's probably still not even here. I would say my 12,800 motor is sitting in the, what is it? If I'm about 12,800, I would say I'm somewhere here, and then my density and my efficiency, I would say it's probably right here, dead center between dense and efficient, and it's about right here in the circle. And you say, well, how do you know that? How do you know where your efficiency is? And the only way to know is having a rating system. And the game tries to give you a rating system with this for efficiency, showing your power per fuel, but it doesn't tell you how dense your motor is, and then it tells you how much power it makes, but it doesn't compare is a 400 horsepower motor that fits in this space versus an 800 motor horsepower fit in this space. So we need some sort of a system to tell us, we need a system to compare space usage, which is a binding box, and I'll explain what I mean by a binding block. Is this motor is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks wide. If you go front to back, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks wide. So it's 5 by 5 by 5. So it's a square motor, and it's only 3 blocks high. So this motor is a 3 by 5 by 5 space. Okay. Now some people will inflate their numbers, but and say, well, if I face this exhaust up and all these 4 blocks right here, let me go into build mode and I could show it better. Blocks, metal block, beam. They say, well, this I could actually put a beam right here because it's not taking up this space. So it's actually really smaller, but I'm going to tell you why that doesn't work. Because if I had a ship that absolutely positively needed that, you would be, if it's great if you have that space that's 5 by 5 by 3 and it's 5 by 5 by 3, but it needs this space open, then you're severely limiting the design of your motor because you absolutely have to have this space open. And what I would argue you're better off doing is coming on your engine test platform and saying, well, I got a 5 by 5 by 5 space, but I need this area and this area. It's taken up by something that's important. Then build a motor specifically for that space. Don't just come and pick a motor, because if you need, say, like the space that's right here above this cylinder open, I couldn't use this motor because I would have to delete this block, which would kill the power and efficiency and all that rating of the motor. So I don't exclude empty space, even though there's if I pulled this motor, oh dang, get stuck. If I pull this motor, the entire top is got an empty space. You could put a beam right here if you put the exhaust up. From this side all the way to the side underneath the thing, there's an empty space. Well, that's a weird space in a boat. And if you could design a whole bunch of motors and then come and say, well, I got this 5x5x3 space, except something interferes at this section. Let's say at the bottom front you had something that was super important. Well, then you could spin this motor around backwards and maybe shoehorn it in. But we need a concrete measuring system for space. So the way I do it, and I've done it on this motor, is I put the binding box. The motor is 3 wide, it's 4 high, and it's 16 long. So that is my binding box. And the way it's hard to tell one motor from another, you go, well, is 3x4x16 taking more space than 5x5x5? Because these motors are vastly different shaped. Well, what I do is I multiply them out and I put it what I call the BB number, the binding box number. This motor is 192, this motor is 125. So this is a smaller motor. It's a cube motor, but this is a beam motor. So I put these numbers down here to show that when the binding box tells me the size of the motor and lets me know if it'll fit in a hole that I have. So if I have somebody came to me and said, man, I need a motor that is 3x4x16. I need as much power as I can fit in that. I'd give them this motor. If they had a 3x5x16, I would give them this motor, which is almost identical but is slightly more efficient. But this motor is a 240 binding box. But comparing to see which motor is smaller, I need this binding box number. And I average it out. I multiply it out and I put it on the card. 240 binding box, 125 binding box, 192 binding box to let me know, to let me at a quick glance say that this is a smaller motor. And then once we do that, we say we have a reference point. We have something that we can tangibly measure. This engine makes 1500 horsepower in 240 blocks. This engine makes 1500 horsepower in 192 blocks. So we know this is a denser motor, but how do we know what density it is? And then we know this motor makes 1600 horsepower in an even smaller area, 125. So we go, how can we compare sizes of motors to horsepowers? Because it's pretty easy to see in these three motors, because this one uses the least amount of space and makes the most horsepower. So it is the most dense. But we need to know, how can we compare this density of this motor to, say, the density of this motor, because this is a 4x4x5 making 300 horsepower. Well, 4x4x5 is 12, is 60 blocks. You say, well, 60, how does 60 blocks compare to 125? Well, it's easy to see that 400 horsepower versus 1600 horsepower in 60 blocks versus 125 is more than half. You know that this motor is more dense. But the easiest way to do it is what the community does, is use density rating. And the density rating, we call it the PPB, or power per block. And what that is horsepower divided by the binding box size. And I don't include empty space because it just inflates your numbers, and it's just like saying my dad can beat up your dad, and there's no real tangible benefit to it. So, and an example would be a 400 horsepower with a 5x5x7 binding box. 5 times 5 times 7 is 175. 400 divided by 175 equals 2.29 power per block. So that motor, motor in that example would have a 2.29 density. And I've done that on these, and that is right here, right after the binding box size. This motor has a density of 7.81. This motor has a density of 12.80. And this motor has a density of 6.25. So that's how we get density. And but we also need to make the point that when we say density now, we're not talking about the density rating of the motor, because the density is the space the motor uses. Once you divide the power by the density, by the space it's using, it's basically saying where you are at on this line, because the power divided by the space is the density. So density refers at where you're at on this line, and what is acceptable, and what is, I would say, a one single cylinder making 0 power would be an infinite density, because it's only one block making 0 power, and it would be infinite density because it's making 0 power. And then once you start making power, to make power you have to go up in your space to make, because you have to make a bigger and a bigger motor to make more and more power. So I don't think there's such a thing where the motor gets so big, is making so much power, it falls out of the triangle. It's not possible. And this is the density rating that we just created. We can't really reach both sides of the triangle, because we can't make 0 power in 0 space, or any power in 0 space, and we can't make power, so much power in such a little bitty space that, so we have to be somewhere along this side of the triangle as a starting point. And that's what the community uses as the power per block density rating. And you say, well, what is a good density rating? How high can it go? It's kind of irrelevant unless if you're going to be downloading other people's motors. This is my wrap. These are my motors. I built every single one of these, with the exception of one, which is this one right here. But the density rating relevance is only relevant from my lowest motor, which is this one, from 1.79, to my highest motor, which is not my motor, 21.3. Now, can it go above 21.3? Yes, it can. It probably can. I haven't really checked the density ratings of other people's motors because I don't really care. I don't think I have anything more dense than 19.2 on this one. But it seems like the density gets to be about 20 point something. I'm pretty sure if I just threw ejectors on this motor, took all these turbos off and threw a whole bunch of yeah, I'd have to take the turbos off, and threw a whole bunch of injectors on the power would go through the roof and the density would go through the roof. But I don't care. I don't make inefficient motors. So my personal density rating on this line of the triangle is 1.79 is the least dense motor, so here, and it does make power, so it is on this side, somewhere in here. And my most dense motor is about 20, so 2 to 20. 2 to 20 is what I personally, with my system, consider a dense or non-dense motor. So the average, I will show you a reason why you can't 100% say that a less density power per thing rating is worse, because you see this motor has a 5.33 density. When you start going down in size of the motor, because the size and the power is intertwined, it's linked together through the formula, as you start losing horsepower, you start losing density. So that doesn't mean a 3.75 is worse than a 5.33. In, let's see, this particular case, it's not necessarily. It's because this motor has 400 horsepower in 175 binding box, and this is a 4x16 is a 80. So this is 75 and this is 80, but this makes less horsepower, so the density is down. So in this particular case, it is worse because this uses 75. Wait, 5 times 5 is 25 times 3. Yes, 75, and this is 4x4 is 16. 16 is 80. Yeah. So in this particular case, it is worse because this uses 80 blocks, this uses 75 blocks, and this makes 300 horsepower, that makes 400 horsepower. So it's using up less space and making more power. So in this particular case, it is worse, but it doesn't always mean it's worse. Like I said, because of the density starts going down. Now this motor is way, way smaller than this motor, because this is a 5x5x3, and this motor is, well, it's, yeah, this one, 3x3x4. This is a way smaller motor, but it's not as dense because it only makes 100 horsepower. So you need to be clear on that density as far as the power triangle is space, but once we multiply it times the power to get the density, we're no longer talking about this point of the triangle, we're talking about the line. And so we need a line between power and efficiency. We need a formula for that, and we need a formula for space versus efficiency. And I haven't come up with those graphs. I haven't figured out those formulas yet, what's the best way to do that. But efficiency can be fairly, what I got as a placeholder is I'm using the power per fuel of the motor, and I'm giving it a class rating. The maximum obtainable efficiency of the motor, I'm just giving it a class rating. And what I have here is this. This sign is what I consider efficient motors, and they either get an A, B, or C class rating, and this is what I consider medium, inefficient motors, but of, different classes. So efficient versus inefficient, and so if it's below a C class, it is a inefficient motor, and if it's above a C class, if it's A, B, or C class, it's efficient motor. So the way I did it is, if you make 400, it's a G. You make above 600, you're a F. You make above 800 power per fuel, you're a E. If you make above 1,000, you're a D class motor. And if you can make about above 1,200 power per fuel, you're an efficient motor, a C class, efficient C class motor. And if you can make above 1,600, it's a B class motor. And if you can make above 2,000, you're an A class motor. And I'll get into the reason why I did this until I can come up with a tangible formula that lets me compare efficiency versus space and power and all that, to where I can compare this little 3-cylinder to this 16-cylinder over here and say which one is a better design. It's easy to do right here. This is a 5.33 density, and this over here is a 19.2 density. So space for power in relation to space per power, this is a better motor across the board. but I need a way to say fuel efficient, because this is a 1288 fuel efficiency, which is a C rating, and this is a 1254 C rating. So they're both the same class motor, but they have different density ratings, different horsepower ratings. So I need a way to come up with it. And I haven't come up with it now, but I think I have come up with a system where I'm on the track, and I'll explain why it's kind of irrelevant, because if you're in an inefficient motor range, between, anything under 400 power per fuel, I typically don't use. And if it's in a small ship, then I try to fit the most power efficient, fuel efficient motor I can in it, if I can't make a C-class motor fit. But here's a C-class motor that's only 3x5x5, makes 400 horsepower, and only uses 0.3 fuel at maximum RPM. So this motor kind of somewhat obsoletes all these motors unless I don't have that space right here. And so 300 C efficiency, the minimum I consider efficient is obtainable. It's just if I don't have this space, then here's a F-class motor, here's a G-class motor. This one doesn't even make it on the scale. Here's a G-class motor, and here's another C-class motor, but it's a 4x4x7, so it's even bigger than this motor. But when this only happens usually in small motors, when you start getting into bigger motors, the efficiency is just whether or not it's efficient or it's not, because you got to fit that in your space. And I use this system because it just lets me let me look at a motor and say how good is it in power, how good is the efficiency in power per fuel. Is it efficient or is it not efficient? If it's an A, B, or C, it's efficient. If it's a D, G, E, and F, it's not efficient, but how inefficient is it? And it just gives me a rating system. And I will get into a point of contention on my efficiency motors, because at 1200 horsepower, at 1200 power per fuel, you start using very little power. And here is an example of a 6400 horsepower motor that uses 5 fuel a second, but it has a C-class rating. That is still decent power fuel usage. That's still a power guzzling motor, but it's also 44 cylinders, 6400 horsepower. So it's still a C rating. So you say, wow, 5 fuel a second versus 0.3 fuel a second. This is not very efficient, but it is, because it still makes 1288 power per fuel. So I started seeing these numbers repeating or very close to 1200. So that's where I started using above 1200 is the C rating. And then when you get into a B rating, I only have one motor on this whole platform. I think it's this one right here. Yeah, it's a B rating. It's hard to configure the parts to get into this B rating configuration. And when you figure out how to place the parts to get into a B rating, you start pushing into the territory of like not this motor, this motor. You start pushing into the 3000 range. So some point in the future, I might, as I start building more efficient motors, I might change the system to where it's above 3000 and then bring that B rating, or I might bring my C rating over to this side, my 1200 over to this side, and then make this 1500 as a C rating, 2000 is a B rating, and 3000 is an A rating. And that's what I did originally when I couldn't make motors above 1200. I thought 1200 was the cap. A rating was 1200, and I had all the way down to a over 100 power per fuel. So the most efficient fuel motors you can make were a G-rated motor. But as I started building better and better motors, 2 motors fell off the chart. this one and this one fell off the chart, and then all of them got their, as I make a more efficient motor, all the other motors get their classes dropped. And 1600 is a hard number to hit, and once you do figure out how to efficiently hit it, you start pushing past 3000, and it's another one of those where the motor is using so little fuel that it's just my dad can beat up your dad. I have more internet points than you. And it's not really usable in the real world. So when I select a motor, I try to go for a C-class motor. And if it comes out like, say, this motor right here, that's an A-class motor, then it's a bonus. But what's more important is that does it fit in the area and does it make the most power. And then if I have a 5x5, let's say this motor is a 5x5x4, and that's what makes this motor unique. It's a 5x5x4, and the motor right next to it is a 5x5x5. But this makes 1200 horsepower, and this makes 800 horsepower. This is a C rating, this is an A rating. So when you get into a tight area like this, that A rating is not going to make or break the motor. I would, in a 5x5x5 area for a battleship, I'd want this 1200 horsepower, I'd want this high density, and a C class is still a good class motor. But let's say I had a 5x5x5 area and I didn't need anywhere near, say I only need 600 horsepower. Well, it might be worth moving up to this A-class motor because I'm using more space to make less power, a third of the power. Actually, I'm only using 25 extra blocks of space, and I'm only making a third of the power, but I'm going from 1.9 fuel at 100% all the way down to 0.3 fuel. So this is where on a medium class ship this motor makes more sense than this motor, and the fact that it's an A class is a bonus compared to this because I don't need the 1200 horsepower, and without 1200 horsepower you can't, if you cut this down to 1200 horsepower, the density would go down. So 8 density is still pretty good. I would rather have the fuel efficiency. See, so I'm giving up power and I'm giving up density or space. Well, I'm gaining space actually, but the density is going down, and I'm using a Class A motor. So that lets us compare. You know, motors. Power is irrelevant because you need as much power as you need, and density just gives us a way to compare power and space. And then the fuel rating, I just made this class system to tell me where a motor sits in the efficiency range, because you come over here and if you do that, you came over here, you say, wow, this motor's pretty dense, it makes a lot of power, but wow, it's using 5 fuel a second. That's not efficient, but it is. It's a C class. So this motor over here only uses 0.3 and is making 800, and you say, well, that's not a lot of power, that's not the most dense, but it's fairly efficient, it's super efficient, but is that efficient compared to that motor? Well, this is an A class and this is a C class, but I don't think I have any other motors that may use 5 fuel a second, but this motor and this motor are the same class because they both use over 1200 power per fuel. But this one drinks 5 fuel a second, this one drinks 0.2 fuel a second. But they're still making the same power per fuel, but since this has so much more power, it's drinking more fuel. So that's the system I came up with. It kind of works for now until I can come up with a better formula, like take horsepower and divide it by the actual fuel it uses to give an additional rating. I guess put another sign over here and take horsepower that it actually makes, because this would make 20 horsepower for 0.1 fuel, but it might be the exact same thing as how the power per fuel is calculated, so it might not be relevant, so it might be redundant, and so I just gave them a fuel rating. But I need to explain one last thing, and then let's say this is our motor. We've got 100% load on it, and this is where it sits in the thing. You know, it's using average density, it's using average power, and it's using average efficiency. I want to show one more point, that the power design triangle is not two-dimensional. It's not a flat design. There is a third dimension. There is a third dimension that engines can move through. And here's our motor sitting in a 2D space. And when we design it, it's going to move around. If we make it more powerful, it comes this way. If we make it more space efficient, it goes that way. If we make it more efficient fuel usage wise, it comes this way. But motors do move in the third dimension, and what that third dimension is RPM. And since this would be maximum power, technically they would be moving down outside the triangle, but since down is into the water, I made up is down. So think of this being upside down, and this is our motor running at 100% load. And as you lower the power of the motor moves this way in the triangle. And why it does that is as you decrease the power, notice this piston is going up. So we're going from 100% to 0 where it maxes out. This motor, this point where this motor was sitting in the design triangle, is now getting further away from efficiency, it's getting further away from density, and it's moving further away from power. And you say, well, how does that work? How does this fourth dimension of power design triangle work? Well, this, like I said, you got to consider this is upside down, but going down is still moving away from both of these, so it works this way. But just understand that this is at 100% load and this is at 0% load. And the reason it moves away from power is because a motor making 2400 power sitting right in the center, or 1000 power sitting in the center, at a 50% load, it's making half the power. So that's easy to understand because half the power is moving away, but it doesn't make it more space efficient and doesn't make it more efficiency. So it's not moving inside the triangle, it's moving away because it's making less power. And then at 0 load, it's furthest away from the power because it's making no power, but it's not moving over here to more efficient, or it's not getting smaller. So that's how it moves away from power. How does it move away from space? The motor doesn't get bigger, so it doesn't move this away. What it does is the density, and it really only makes sense because it really doesn't move away from this corner of the triangle. The space of the motor is the space of the motor no matter what. But it moves away from density in this corner because power is now related to space. So whatever the density, say it's an 8 density here, as it makes less power, as it makes half power, the density goes from 8 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to 0. As it makes no power, the density is whatever, every block you place makes 0 power, so the density is now infinite. The density goes down to 0 at 0 because you're making 0 power. So that's how it moves away. It's not that the motor's getting bigger, it's that it's making less power in the same space. So that's why it moves away from density or space. And then you go, well, why does it move away from efficiency? It doesn't 100% move away from efficiency, but once again, most motor designs, not all, but most motor designs, this motor makes 1200 power per fuel at 100%, and notice it makes less power per fuel the lower, and that is repeated over and over and over on most motors. This one's 1, 2, 3. The only place, there is some motors like, which one? I think maybe it's this one. Yeah, this motor is more efficient at lower RPMs than it is at high RPMs. So in that particular scenario, that motor doesn't 100% move just 100% here, 0% here. The 100% point might be way down below where this piston starts, and it might move up through. And that's the important point that I want to make, that a motor can move in and out of the space. Even if it's average, it can move in and out. And the only way to tell where you're at in this space, where your starting point is in this space, the space doesn't move much. Let's say it moves 1 or 2 blocks below or 1 or 2 blocks above in the efficiency. It's basically the power curve is what's doing it. The power curve determines your starting spot. Just be aware that this is something that is possible, and the RPM is the 4th dimension. And this is the last point I want to make for this video, because it's about measurement. And just be aware that motors get less efficient, less space efficient, less fuel efficient, and less power efficient. They move away from all 3 boxes as the RPMs go down. And why is this important? Why would this be important? Let's say we want to use this little motor right here. Well, let me pick a better motor, something that's more linear. See, this motor right here uses 0.6 at 10%, where it's making 150 horsepower. At 50%, it's making 750 horsepower, and it uses 1.1 fuel. And at 100%, it's making 1.2 fuel. So this is my 3rd stat, and this is why I do this. This motor is 1288, so it achieves a C class at 100%, but it uses 1.2 fuel. But it reaches maximum efficiency of 1301 power per fuel at 1455 horsepower. Now, if you needed 1500 horsepower, your ship absolutely positively have to have 1500 horsepower. You need a bigger motor. If you can't run this 1455, you lose out. You've missed the point of your motor, and you missed the point. And what I would argue is that this motor uses the maximum fuel efficiency at 1.1, so at 97%. So we'll look at that on the curve. At 97% is 1301. If I go up to 98%, it's 1292, but it still uses 1.1 fuel. The piston really hasn't moved. It's moved away from efficiency a little bit. It's moved towards power a little bit because we're making more power, and the density has gone up because we're making more power again, because space is tied to power. So the more power we make, the better this gets. But when we go to 99, we're less efficient, but we're making more power, and we're more dense because we're making more power in the same amount of space now. But when we go to 100%, the density reaches maximum, the power reaches maximum, but the fuel efficiency tanks. It gets into a point of the power curve where it's less efficient because it's using more fuel. It's using more fuel for a 15% power at 99% and a 35% power at 97 power. So we need to go where do we make 1.1 power? Well, we make we use 1.1 fuel at, I think it's somewhere around Okay, here it is, right here. 35% we're using 1.1 fuel, but we're only making 525 power, all the way up to 99% we're using 1.1 fuel. So you say, okay, well, if I limit it down to 99%, we're not getting outside of the efficiency curve of this motor. And all the way from 35% to 99%, this thing uses 1.1 fuel. Okay, well, we don't need the motor to demonstrate that anymore. If I can go from 34% here all the way to 99% here and use 1.1 fuel, where is the most efficient use? Well, the most power that I make is going to be the most powerful. The most power that I make at 99% is going to be the most dense, and the most efficient is going to be using 1.1 fuel to make the most amount of power per fuel. So again, at 99% is the most efficient. So it's the most powerful, it's the most dense, and it's the most fuel efficient, because running at 35% over here is using 1.1 fuel, and using 99% is 1.1 fuel. So running this motor anywhere other than 99% is less efficient fuel wise. It's making less power, so it's less powerful, and it's making less power per space. Now, pushing it up to 100% would make it more powerful, and it would make it more dense, but it doesn't make it more fuel efficient because it jumps up to 1.2 fuel instead of 1.1. So on this motor right here, the ideal use case scenario would be to lock the drive factor to 0.99, or set up an ACB to charge batteries to say that at, say, 90, if the batteries fall below 90%, turn this motor on to 99%, and when the batteries get above 98% or 99%, turn this motor off. Okay, and that makes this motor the most efficient. If you want to get the last percentile of efficiency out of the motor, would be to turn it off when you don't use it. And how do you do that? Because you can't drive your ship without making power. So the best way to do it, if you have space and you want the maximum efficiency, is turn this into an electric generator and make your ship electric. Put down one electric block, put enough batteries to let the ship run for, say, like a minute or so, and then make your motor a charge only motor and make it run at its maximum efficiency, or the highest you could push it without using more fuel than what it reaches at maximum efficiency. And that is the last key into getting the most efficiency out of a motor, and it shows the importance of having a rating system. And I hope that helps you guys with the physically visualizing with the power triangle over here, and shows you the fourth dimension of the power triangle and what that really is doing, and why it's not the best thing to do running engines anywhere above or below, above maximum efficiency or below maximum efficiency. If you can do it, you're better off having if you want maximum efficiency, you're better off putting in if you have the space, put in battery banks and run a diesel electric over battery, a diesel electric, is better. An electric craft is always more efficient than, because let's say this motor to my ship uses about 750 horsepower. Well, running this motor at 750 horsepower gives me the worst efficiency. It gives me a better efficiency rating than idling it, but it doesn't. It uses the worst, probably the worst efficiency this motor can do running at 750. So the best way to make this motor continuously run at 750 but keep it in the maximum fuel efficiency rating is running it half the time. If you was using 750 and you put enough batteries underneath this thing and an electric motor to back this thing up, your ship would be still continuously using 750 power out of your battery. But then when, say, it dropped below 50%, this thing would kick on and then charge your batteries up. Well, then it would shut off. And I think if you set it at a 50% and you balanced your batteries out to where it could run and stay on and off 50% of the time, it would be the same as this thing running at 0.5%, at 50% all the time, or running at 100% half of the time. It would use the same amount of fuel. You'd say, okay, well, it averages out to the same amount of fuel, but it doesn't, because when it's running, it's getting its maximum efficiency when it is running, and when it's turning off, it's using infinite. It has an infinite efficiency because it's making 0 power and it's using 0 fuel. So it doesn't average out, because Infinity averaged with maximum efficiency of 1.1 fuel, making what was it, 1,485 horsepower. You can't average Infinity with maximum efficiency. But if you can average maximum efficiency with maximum inefficiency, which is at 50% power. So if I ran this motor continuously at 50% load, it would be the maximum inefficient that this motor can be, and it would be moving up on the power curve graph so high that it's at maximum inefficiency. It's moved away from all 3 points on the triangle, but keeping it at 100% load, it stays where I designed it. I designed it in the center of the triangle, and it never moves outside. So the only way I can cheat the fourth dimension is by running it at maximum efficiency and then turning it off when I don't need it. And the only way you can run your propellers and anything your ship needs power-wise is by having an electric backup system. And this is why I say an electric craft with an electric generator is the most efficient, and running your motors at anything other than max efficiency or on either side of max efficiency that still uses the same power per fuel. Well, running below max efficiency and still using the same power per fuel is still making less power, still getting a less dense motor, because you're making less power in the same space. But running a motor from maximum efficiency all the way up to where it starts to fall off and use more actual fuel. So this particular motor is a real good example because it only does it at the last 99%. Now, this motor, why it is more efficient? Because I can go up to 100% and still use the same amount of fuel that it uses at the maximum efficiency. On this motor is still at 97, and I'll show that here. 97, it achieves a 1370. At 96, it's still a 1358, and at 100% it's still 1356. But notice as I move it down, it never comes off the 1.1 once it settles out. I think it goes down to like 80. No, it's actually going down even further. This is a way more efficient motor. Okay, there we go. One. So at 70% to 100%, this motor still uses 1.1 fuel. But I'd still argue that at 70% I'm making 70% of the power. But this would be if you don't have room for battery backup and you can't run your motors. This motor from 70 to 100% still uses the same amount of fuel. So if this motor was using 1,050, say 1,000 to 1,500 horsepower continuously, it doesn't really matter because it's still using 1.1 fuel. And so this would be a better kinetic drive motor, and the other one over there would be a better generator backup motor, because this motor is a higher efficiency motor. It gives up a little bit of density, but that takes me into the next part of the design, and I'll probably take a little break to design because I'm getting ahead of myself. I haven't labeled all my motors and decided what's the best use case for each one of them, but I hope that it just shows you guys that the design triangle is something that's real. Power, we just make a engine as powerful as we need, and then we move between density and efficiency. So we never really get on this side of the triangle. We really stay on this half of the triangle, and you always strive for smallest motor possible, and then you always strive for the most efficient motor in that design. But this is a real thing, and if you move toward more powerful motor, it moves away from these, and then it exposes you to the fourth dimension of power, which is up and down. And motors can move slightly, their starting point slightly above and below the flat surface, and then as you lower RPMs, they go up, which moves them away from all three sides. And that is why you don't want to run your motors at lower power if you have the room to put in battery backup. And I see you guys in the next one.